A different kind of leadership. Derek Lawson had always believed that leadership wasn't just about numbers. It was about people. It was about understanding the struggles of those who worked tirelessly to keep the business running. That's why, even as the CEO of Ashford National Bank, he refused to be the kind of leader who made decisions solely from the comfort of a corner office. For years, Derek had followed a personal tradition. Every few months, he would go undercover, stripping himself of the power his title gave him, walking into his own branches as an ordinary customer. Most of the time, he found minor inefficiencies, long wait times, overworked tellers, a system glitch here and there. But every now and then, he saw something that shook him to his core. And tonight, in a small Columbus, Ohio branch, he was about to uncover something far worse than he had ever imagined. The calm before the storm. The bank appeared perfectly ordinary when Derek walked in just before closing hours. The air was crisp with the artificial cold of overpowered air conditioning, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the polished floors. A few customers lingered at the counter, chatting with tellers as they finalized their transactions. Derek blended into the scene effortlessly. Dressed in a casual button-down with his sleeves rolled up and a pair of jeans, he looked like any other working professional stopping by after a long day. His gait was relaxed, his expression neutral, but inside, he was already scanning the environment, watching for the small, unspoken details that could tell him the real story. Behind the counter, tellers worked with the ease of routine, handling deposits and withdrawals with mechanical precision. Their smiles were polite but lacked warmth, the kind of detachment that came from working in a place that demanded efficiency over connection. And then, Derek heard it. A sound so soft it almost blended into the background. The faint, muffled sound of someone crying. At first, he thought he had imagined it. But as he stepped forward in line, it became clearer. It was coming from the break room, just past the teller stations. The door was slightly ajar, offering him a glimpse inside. A young woman sat at the table, her fingers gripping the edge like it was the only thing holding her together. Her shoulders trembled as she let out a quiet, broken sob. Derek's stomach tightened. He had seen employees frustrated before, overwhelmed by long hours or difficult customers. But this was different. This was pain. Another employee, a young man in his 20s, stood beside her, speaking in hushed tones. Derek couldn't hear everything, but he caught a few words. "Jasmine, you can't let him do this to you. He doesn't own you." Jasmine. The way she shook her head, the way her voice cracked when she whispered her response, it sent a chill down Derek's spine. What choice do I have? If I don't do what he says, I'm gone. It wasn't about a customer. It wasn't about the job itself. It was about someone. And Derek wasn't leaving until he found out who. The watchful eyes of control. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Sir, I can help you over here." Derek turned to the young man behind the counter. The name tag read Kenny. He looked fresh out of college, his polite smile doing little to hide the unease in his eyes. Derek stepped forward, handing over a deposit slip he had brought for occasions just like this. "Long day?" he asked casually. Kenny hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yeah. Fridays are always busy." It was a safe answer, an automatic response. But Derek had spent enough time in the banking industry to recognize when someone was holding back. As Kenny processed the transaction, Derek glanced around again. That's when he spotted the manager. A man in a stiff gray suit stood near the back of the bank, watching the room like a hawk. His posture was rigid, his eyes calculating. There was something about him that immediately put Derek on edge. Not just authority. Control. Derek turned back to Kenny and lowered his voice. "That your branch manager?" Kenny's fingers hesitated on the keyboard. He didn't look up. "Yes, sir." Derek nodded, his mind already working. "What's his name?" Another hesitation. Then, almost reluctantly, "Ron Halverson." Derek stored the name away. "You been here long?" Kenny forced a smile, but it was tight. A little over a year. And then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the bank, he added, "Long enough." Long enough for what? Derek didn't press. Not yet. He took the receipt Kenny slid across the counter. "Take care of yourself, Kenny." Kenny's shoulders stiffened, and for just a second, his mask cracked. Then, just as quickly, he forced his expression back to neutral. "You too, sir." Derek stepped away, but he wasn't done. A silent cry for help. He found a spot near the loan officer's desk and pulled out his phone, pretending to check messages. From this position, he had a clear view of the break room. Jasmine had stopped crying, but her hands still trembled in her lap. The young man beside her, Miles, was speaking urgently, but she wasn't meeting his eyes. And then, Derek saw Halverson move. He walked toward the break room with slow, deliberate steps. The moment Jasmine saw him, her entire body went rigid. She scrambled to wipe her face, stuffing her phone into her pocket as she stood up. It was the reaction of someone who had been caught doing something they weren't supposed to. Halverson leaned in close, speaking just low enough that Derek couldn't hear. Whatever he said, Jasmine gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Then, without a word, she walked past him, heading back to her teller station. Derek's jaw tightened. He didn't know exactly what was happening here, but he had seen enough to know this wasn't just a bad day at work. It was fear. And he wasn't walking away. The decision to act. Derek had two choices. He could leave and handle this from a corporate level, investigate from a distance, have HR look into it, and take action through official channels. That was the safe, professional way to deal with it. Or he could get answers now. His gut told him this wasn't something that could wait. He scanned the room, looking for an opening. Miles was still near the side counter, organizing deposit slips. Derek walked over, keeping his tone casual. "Hey, do you have a pen?" Miles looked up, startled. "Oh, yeah." He handed one over. Derek took it but didn't leave. "You work with Jasmine a lot." Miles hesitated. "Yeah." Derek lowered his voice. "She seems upset. Everything okay?" Miles' grip on the stack of papers tightened. "She's fine." It was a lie. Not because he wanted to mislead Derek, but because he was afraid. Derek met his gaze. "If something's wrong, I want to help." Miles swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Halverson. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "It's him. It's always been him." Derek felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He had his answer. And now, it was time to act. The weight of silence. Derek Lawson stood in the middle of the small Columbus, Ohio branch, his mind racing with everything he had just uncovered. Jasmine wasn't just another overworked employee. She was a young woman trapped under the control of a manager who wielded power like a weapon. And Derek had seen this before. Bad bosses came in different forms. Some were incompetent, some were negligent, but the worst were those who knew exactly what they were doing. They thrived in places where fear kept people silent, where job security was dangled like a leash, where no one believed they had another option. Ron Halverson was one of those men. Derek had walked into this branch expecting to find minor inefficiencies, maybe some outdated procedures, but now he was staring at something far more sinister. And he was done standing still, a predator in the office. Derek took a slow breath, steadying himself. He couldn't storm into Halverson's office and demand answers. Not yet. He needed more. He turned his attention back to Miles, the young employee who had given him his first real confirmation that something was wrong. Miles was still fidgeting with the deposit slips, but his hands were shaking. "It's him. It's always been him," he had said. Those words replayed in Derek's mind, and he knew exactly what they meant. Halverson was the problem. Derek needed details, real, undeniable proof that went beyond what he had observed. So he lowered his voice and leaned in slightly. "Miles, listen to me. I know you're scared, but if something is happening, I can stop it. You just have to tell me. Miles looked up sharply, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. His gaze darted to the back of the branch, where Halverson stood near his office, arms crossed, surveying the room like he owned it. I can't, Miles whispered. Fear. It was always fear. Derek understood. He had been there once, a long time ago, just another low-level employee afraid to rock the boat. But now he was the CEO, and he had the power to sink that boat if he had to. What happens when the bank closes? Derek asked, keeping his voice light enough to seem like casual conversation. Do people stay late? Miles hesitated. Sometimes. Derek pressed. Jasmine stays late, doesn't she? A flicker of something. Guilt, frustration, anger crossed Miles' face. She never wants to. But he makes her. Derek's stomach clenched. He already knew what was happening, but he needed to hear it. Halverson. Miles exhaled sharply and nodded. Yeah, it's always just her. I mean, technically, he says it's for work, but we all know it's not. No one else is required to stay. No one else gets pulled into his office at the end of the night. Derek's blood ran cold. This wasn't just toxic management. This was manipulation, coercion. This was abuse of power. He had heard enough. He patted Miles on the shoulder once, offering the young man a silent promise. You don't have to say any more. Miles nodded stiffly, then quickly turned back to his work, like he wanted to pretend the conversation never happened. Derek didn't blame him. Because now it was his job to make sure Halverson never did this to anyone again. A strategic play. Derek had built his career on knowing when to observe and when to act. Right now, he needed to do both. He turned and walked toward the exit, moving slowly, making it seem like he was leaving. He pushed open the glass doors, stepped outside, and let the cool night air hit his face. Then he stopped. He leaned against his car, pulling out his phone, pretending to check something. In reality, he was watching the bank, watching Halverson. The branch was preparing to close, customers filtering out one by one. Employees moved through their final tasks with quiet efficiency, but there was an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Halverson stayed near the back, close to his office, watching everything. Derek had seen men like him before. The way he carried himself, the way he lingered, was enough to make Derek's skin crawl. And then, like clockwork, Halverson made his move. He called Jasmine over. Derek saw her hesitate, just for a second. Saw the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous tick. But she went. She always went. That was the problem. Derek clenched his jaw. He knew what was happening. Halverson was making sure everyone else left first. A perfect predator. Derek took a slow breath and exhaled. He wasn't leaving. Not until he stopped this. The confrontation. Derek waited. He gave it 5 minutes, then 10, watching through the glass windows. The bank was nearly empty now. Only Jasmine, Halverson, and a few other employees finishing up. Derek had seen enough. He pushed off his car and walked straight back into the bank. The security guard at the entrance barely gave him a glance. Derek still looked like just another customer, returning for some forgotten errand. But his steps were purposeful. Straight past the teller stations, past the empty cubicles, right toward Halverson's office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Jasmine sat in the chair across from Halverson's desk, her back stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Halverson leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, too relaxed. He was saying something, his voice just low enough that Derek couldn't hear. But Jasmine's shoulders were tense, and Derek knew. Without knocking, without hesitation, Derek stepped into the doorway. I hope I'm not interrupting. Halverson looked up, startled. Then his expression shifted, irritation flickering across his face. Excuse me, this is a private meeting. Derek smiled. Not anymore. He stepped inside and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his executive ID badge. The color drained from Halverson's face. "Derek Lawson," he said, his voice perfectly even. "CEO of Ashford National Bank." Jasmine let out a sharp breath, eyes wide. Miles and Kenny, still lingering in the lobby, froze. The room went completely silent. Halverson's mouth opened, then closed. He was scrambling, his mind trying to catch up with the fact that the stranger in his office wasn't a stranger at all. Derek took a step forward, his gaze locking onto Halverson's. "I suggest you stand up." Halverson hesitated for only a second before slowly rising from his chair. Derek's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. "You and I are going to have a very long conversation." Jasmine was still frozen in her seat, her hands shaking. Derek glanced at her and softened his tone. "You don't have to stay here anymore, Jasmine." She blinked, like she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Derek nodded. "You're safe now." And this time, when Jasmine inhaled, her shoulders dropped, just slightly. Because for the first time in a long time, she believed it. What comes next? Derek turned his attention back to Halverson. The man was trying to recover, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Sir, Derek didn't let him finish. "Save it." His voice was like steel. "You've been abusing your power for too long. That ends tonight." Halverson swallowed. He knew it. He was done. Derek reached for his phone, already dialing corporate HR, because some men only stopped when someone stronger took their power away, and Derek was about to take everything. Breaking the chains, Derek Lawson stood in the center of Ron Halverson's office, his executive ID badge still in hand. The weight of what was about to happen pressed against the air, thick with unspoken tension. Jasmine sat frozen in her chair, her hands gripping the armrests as though she needed to ground herself. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was something else. Hope. Halverson, however, had gone pale. The moment he saw Derek's badge, the moment the reality of the situation sunk in, he had stiffened. He had spent years holding this branch in the palm of his hand, manipulating his employees into submission. But now, standing face to face with the CEO of Ashford National Bank, he was losing his grip. Derek didn't move, didn't blink. He let Halverson sit in his fear for a long moment before speaking. "Shut the door." The command was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. Halverson hesitated. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Now." Jasmine shot up from her seat so quickly that her chair wobbled. Derek turned to her, his voice softening. "Jasmine, you can leave. Go home." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" Derek nodded once. "I got this." And for the first time, Jasmine didn't question it. She nodded, grabbed her bag, and without sparing Halverson another glance, walked out the door. The silence left in her wake was suffocating. Once the door clicked shut, Derek's attention returned to the man in front of him. Halverson straightened, trying to gather whatever scraps of authority he still had. "Sir, I assure you." Derek raised a hand. The words died in Halverson's throat. "You're done." The weight of power. Derek paced slowly, his eyes never leaving Halverson. "Tell me, Ron, how long have you been in this position?" Halverson exhaled sharply. He was trying to regain control, but Derek could see the cracks in his composure. 6 years, he admitted. Derek nodded, as if considering. 6 years. And in those 6 years, how many employees have quit under your watch? Halverson stiffened. Turnover is common in the banking industry. Derek let out a humorless chuckle. "Nice try. But I already had corporate HR pull the reports before I walked in here tonight." Halverson's eyes widened slightly. Derek pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Then he turned it around so Halverson could see. A list of names. Dozens. More than any other branch in the district. 52 employees have left this branch in the last 3 years, Derek said, voice even. And of those, 28 left with no job lined up. They just walked away. Halverson stayed silent. Derek took another step forward. You created an environment so toxic, so unbearable, that people chose unemployment over working under you. Do you know how rare that is? Halverson exhaled through his nose. I expect high standards. That's not a crime. Derek arched a brow. No, but coercion is. Halverson's fingers curled into fists. Jasmine told me everything. It was a lie. She hadn't said much at all. But Derek didn't need her to. Halverson took a step back. That's... Derek cut him off. She wasn't the first, was she? No, I bet you've been doing this for a long time. Taking advantage of your position, making certain employees stay late under the guise of work, making them feel like they owe you something, making them feel trapped. Halverson's lips parted slightly, his face paling even further. Save it. Derek's voice dropped to something colder, something lethal. I've seen men like you before. You don't stop unless someone stops you. The silence stretched thick between them. Then Halverson's mask cracked. Fine. His voice wavered slightly. What do you want? Derek almost laughed at the audacity. You still think you have leverage here? Halverson swallowed hard. Derek exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're fired. Halverson flinched, his body going rigid. You can't just... Yes, I can. Derek's voice was firm. And not only are you fired, but I'm ensuring you will never work in the banking industry again. Halverson's face twisted. You have no proof. Derek smirked. You'd be surprised. He tapped his phone. See, Ron, I don't need you to admit to anything. I have 52 former employees willing to speak. I have enough data to bury you. And if that's not enough... He tapped his pocket where a discreet voice recorder was nestled. I've got tonight. The blood drained from Halverson's face. Derek let the silence settle for a beat before leaning in slightly. You have two options. Halverson's breathing was shallow. Option 1. I report you immediately. I ensure your reputation is destroyed. You face full investigation, possible legal action, and you'll never work in this industry again. Halverson swallowed hard. And Option 2. Derek's voice dropped lower. You resign. Quietly. Effective immediately. No severance. No recommendations. Nothing. You leave this office tonight, and you never set foot in another Ashford branch again. Halverson clenched his jaw. Derek straightened. Choose. For a moment, Halverson stood there, breathing heavily, his mind calculating his next move. Then, slowly, he exhaled. Fine. Derek crossed his arms. I need to hear you say it. Halverson's voice was tight with suppressed anger. I resign. Derek nodded once. Good. Without another word, he turned and walked to the office door. But before he stepped out, he glanced back. Oh, and one more thing. Halverson looked up. Derek smirked. If I ever hear that you've tried this again, anywhere, I'll make sure you regret it. With that, he stepped out and closed the door behind him. The aftermath. The moment Derek stepped back into the main lobby, all eyes were on him. Jasmine, Miles, Kenny, the other employees who had been afraid to speak. He took a slow breath before speaking. Ron Halverson is no longer employed at this bank. A heavy silence. Then, slowly, Jasmine let out a shaky breath. Kenny blinked. Wait, he's gone. Derek nodded. Jasmine's hands trembled at her sides, but for the first time, her shoulders relaxed. Miles exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Holy. Derek smiled slightly. You're safe now, and things are going to change. And this time, they believed him. Restoring trust, rebuilding hope. For the first time in years, the Columbus branch of Ashford National Bank was free from Ron Halverson's grip. His reign of quiet intimidation had ended with a single conversation behind a closed office door. A man who had spent years manipulating his power had folded in minutes when he realized he had none left. But Derek Lawson knew the real fight was just beginning. Firing a corrupt manager was one thing. Fixing the damage he had left behind, that was something else entirely. A new chapter begins. The tension inside the branch hadn't completely faded. Yes, Halverson was gone. And yes, his toxic influence had been cut off at the root. But the employees who had suffered under him for years weren't celebrating just yet. Because fear doesn't disappear overnight. Jasmine, Miles, Kenny, all of them had spent so long watching their backs, waiting for the other shoe to drop. They had learned that silence was survival, that speaking up had consequences. Derek had changed the rules in one night. Now he had to prove that those changes were real. He stepped forward, placing his hands in his pockets. I know this branch has been through a lot. His voice was steady but softer than before. And I know that trust is earned, not given. Jasmine, who was still processing what had happened, swallowed hard. Is he really gone? Derek nodded. For good. She exhaled, and though she still looked uncertain, the relief in her expression was unmistakable. Miles, who had always been a little braver than the others, narrowed his eyes slightly. So what now? We just go back to work like nothing happened. Derek shook his head. No, we start fresh. And that means we need to have a real conversation about what's been happening here. The employees exchanged hesitant glances. For years, their concerns had gone unheard. Corporate visits had come and gone, with no real change. Even when complaints had been filed, nothing ever happened. But this time, the CEO himself was standing in front of them. This time, they weren't being dismissed. The stories they never told. Derek walked to the center of the room and motioned toward the break room. Let's talk. No titles, no ranks, just an honest conversation. It was a simple offer, but one that sent a ripple of uncertainty through the team. They weren't used to this. Jasmine hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. One by one, the employees followed her lead. Inside the break room, the air was thick with unspoken words. The same room where Jasmine had cried just hours before. The same space where whispered conversations had been exchanged in fear. Now, they were sitting together as equals. Derek sat at the edge of the table, leaning forward. Tell me the truth. What was it really like working under Halverson? For a long moment, silence. Then Kenny, who had barely spoken before, let out a humorless laugh. It was hell. Derek nodded, encouraging him to continue. He controlled everything, Kenny said, shaking his head. If you stepped out of line, even a little, he'd make your life miserable. Scheduling you for impossible shifts, denying time off, making you stay late for performance reviews that were just him reminding you that he could fire you whenever he wanted. Jasmine tensed. That's how it started for me. First, it was extra shifts. Then, it was closing responsibilities that only I had to do. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. I knew what he was doing. We all did. But what could I do? I needed this job. I needed to pay rent. Derek's jaw tightened. It was exactly what he had suspected. Halverson had created an environment where fear was currency. He had made sure no one ever felt safe enough to challenge him. And for years, it had worked. Miles leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. And HR. They never did anything. People complained, but somehow it always got buried. Derek exhaled sharply. That's going to change. The room fell silent again. Then Jasmine asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. How do we know? How do we know this isn't just another corporate promise that won't mean anything in a month? Derek met her gaze, his expression firm. Because I'm not going anywhere. Rewriting the system. For years, the Columbus branch had been a place where voices were silenced. Derek was about to change that. He pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. Starting today, I want a direct line of communication between this branch and me. No more waiting for someone at corporate to notice a problem. No more hoping someone will care enough to do something. Kenny frowned. Wait, you mean, we can actually talk to you? Like directly? Derek nodded. That's exactly what I mean. I don't want anyone here to feel powerless ever again. Jasmine's brows furrowed. No offense, sir, but don't you have bigger things to do than check in on one branch? Derek smiled. This branch is part of my company. That makes it my responsibility. And more importantly, it makes you my responsibility. The room was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something new. Trust. The next step. With Halverson gone, there was work to do. The first step was ensuring the Columbus branch had a new manager, one that wouldn't let history repeat itself. Derek turned to Miles, who had proven himself as someone willing to speak up, even when it was risky. How would you feel about stepping into a leadership role? Miles blinked. Me. Derek nodded. You know this branch better than anyone. You understand what needs to change. And most importantly, I know you won't let what happened before happen again. Miles swallowed. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'd be honored. Derek turned to the rest of the team. This isn't just about one promotion. It's about changing the way this bank operates. From now on, every employee at Ashford should feel safe, heard, respected. Jasmine exhaled, shaking her head. It still doesn't feel real. Derek smiled. Get used to it. For the first time since he had walked into the Columbus branch, Jasmine smiled back. And that was when Derek knew. He had come here expecting to find small inefficiencies. Instead, he had uncovered something much bigger, something that had forced him to question the very way his company operated. But now, standing in a room full of employees who had been given a voice for the first time in years, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about changing everything. The promise. Before he left, Derek made one last statement. If any of you ever feel like history is repeating itself, if you ever feel like you're being silenced again, call me. I don't care if it's 2 a.m. I don't care if I'm in a meeting. Call me. Jasmine looked at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of dishonesty. She didn't find any. She nodded. Okay. Derek took one last glance around the break room, where fear had once ruled. Not anymore. Not ever again. The rebuild begins. Derek Lawson had seen a lot in his years climbing the banking industry. He had met his fair share of bad managers, but Ron Halverson had been one of the worst. And the worst part, Halverson wasn't unique. There were more like him. More people in positions of power who exploited their authority, manipulating employees who couldn't afford to push back. Derek had taken one of them down tonight, but his job wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about firing one bad manager. It was about fixing the entire system that allowed him to exist in the first place. An unfinished fight. Derek sat in the break room for another 30 minutes, listening. This was what corporate always got wrong. They implemented policies, made decisions from the comfort of their executive offices, but they never really listened to the people on the front lines. He refused to make the same mistake. Jasmine spoke first. I used to love this job, she admitted, staring at the table. Before Halverson. Before it got bad. Derek nodded, encouraging her to continue. She took a deep breath. It wasn't just about the paycheck. I liked talking to customers, helping people figure out their finances. But after a while, it didn't feel like a job anymore. It felt like. She hesitated, then finally whispered, a prison. Miles clenched his jaw. Yeah, we all felt it. But quitting wasn't an option for most of us. We had bills to pay, families to support. Halverson knew that. That's why he got away with so much. Derek let out a slow breath, his hands resting on the table. I need to know everything, he said. Not just about Halverson, but about what it was like working under him. I want to know how deep this problem goes. The employees exchanged hesitant glances. Corporate leaders didn't ask these kinds of questions. Not usually. But Derek wasn't just another corporate leader. Kenny leaned forward. I don't think people in your position really understand how hard it is to speak up when your whole livelihood is on the line. Derek nodded. You're right. I didn't. Not fully. But I do now. Kenny exhaled. Good, because HR sure as hell wasn't listening. Derek's eyes darkened. Tell me about that. Miles rubbed the back of his neck. A few people filed complaints. Some even quit after reporting him. But nothing happened. It was like everything just disappeared. Derek's stomach tightened. He had suspected as much. Who handled those complaints? Miles shrugged. Corporate HR, I guess, but we never heard back. No follow-ups, no investigations. Just silence. Jasmine crossed her arms. And you know the worst part. Some of us didn't even bother reporting him because we knew it wouldn't matter. We knew nothing would change. Derek clenched his jaw. That was the part that made him angriest. Not just that Halverson had been able to get away with it, but that his employees had been conditioned to believe that no one would help them, that they had no voice, that no one cared, and that more than anything was about to change. A broken system. Derek pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. This is Michael Grant. Michael Grant was the Chief Human Resources Officer for Ashford National Bank. Derek didn't waste time. We need to talk. There was a brief pause before Michael replied. Derek, it's nearly 9 o'clock at night. What's going on? Derek's voice was like steel. I just fired a branch manager for abusing his power. And now I'm finding out that multiple complaints against him were ignored. I want to know why. Silence. Then, a slow inhale from the other end of the line. Where are you? Michael asked. Columbus, and I'm not leaving until I get answers. Michael hesitated. Derek, you know as well as I do that HR processes hundreds of complaints. Sometimes things slip through the cracks. Derek's jaw tightened. 52 employees have left this branch in the last 3 years, Michael. 28 of them walked away without another job lined up. That's not something that slips through the cracks. That's systemic failure. Michael sighed. Okay, I'll pull the files first thing tomorrow. No, you'll pull them now. Another pause. Then, you're serious. Dead serious. I need to know how far this goes. Because if complaints were buried here, how many others were buried in our other branches? Michael was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, all right, I'll call you back in an hour. Derek ended the call and turned back to the employees. HR is investigating this tonight, and if I find out someone has been covering up complaints, they'll be fired before the sun rises. Jasmine stared at him. Just like that. Derek nodded. Just like that. Because protecting bad managers at the expense of good employees was something he wouldn't tolerate. Not anymore. Changing the culture. Derek stood, running a hand through his hair. We can't fix the past, but we can make sure this never happens again. Kenny raised an eyebrow. How? Derek smiled. We start with transparency. He pulled out his phone again and sent a message to his assistant. Within seconds, she replied. Then he looked at the team. Tomorrow morning, I'm making an announcement to the entire company. Every employee at Ashford National Bank will receive an email with a direct, anonymous way to report workplace abuse, straight to me. Miles' eyes widened. Wait, you? Not HR. Derek nodded. Not HR. Not their managers. Me. The room fell silent. Then Jasmine let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. You're really doing this? Derek met her gaze. I promised you I would. Kenny shook his head, smiling. I never thought I'd see the day. Miles chuckled. Guess we finally got a CEO who gives a damn. Derek smirked. Damn right you do. For the first time in a long time, the Columbus branch of Ashford National Bank wasn't drowning in fear. And Derek, he wasn't just fixing a broken branch. He was changing the way his entire company worked. For good. The truth behind closed doors. Derek Lawson leaned against the breakroom counter, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights droning above him. His conversation with the employees had been productive, eye-opening, even. But the deeper issue still remained. How had Ron Halverson been allowed to get away with this for so long? Derek had spent years building Ashford National Bank with a foundation of integrity. He had hand-picked executives he trusted. He had invested in training programs and leadership development. And yet, here he was, standing in a branch where employees had been suffering in silence, a branch where complaints had disappeared. And if it had happened here, how many other locations had similar stories? His phone buzzed. He checked the screen. Michael Grant, incoming call. Derek exhaled sharply before answering. Tell me you have something. Michael's voice was tight. You were right. Derek's grip on the phone tightened. How bad? Michael let out a slow breath. Worse than we thought. Someone's been filtering complaints before they even make it to corporate HR. Derek straightened. What do you mean? Michael hesitated. It looks like there was a regional review process in place for certain branches. Complaints from employees at those locations never made it to corporate. They were handled at the regional level. Derek's stomach turned. Who was in charge of those reviews? Another pause. Then Michael's voice dropped. David Spencer. Derek went cold. David Spencer was the Senior Vice President of Regional Operations for Ashford National Bank, and he was supposed to be one of Derek's most trusted executives. A system designed to fail. Derek didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Michael, sensing his silence, pressed forward. I cross-referenced the branches that fell under Spencer's regional review process. Every single one had higher than normal turnover. Every single one had complaints about management. And every single one had reports that never made it to corporate HR. Derek inhaled sharply. So this wasn't just incompetence. No, Michael said, voice grim. This was intentional. Derek clenched his jaw. David Spencer had been with Ashford for nearly a decade. He had built a reputation as a fixer, someone who handled problem branches before they became liabilities. But now, Derek could see the truth. Spencer hadn't been fixing anything. He had been burying problems, silencing employees, protecting toxic managers. And Halverson, he had been one of many. Confronting the machine. Derek checked the time. 9:43 p.m. Late, but not too late. He turned back to Michael. Get Spencer on the phone. Now. Michael hesitated. Derek, this is bigger than just him. If Spencer was running this cover-up, we need to figure out how high this goes. We need to be strategic. We don't have time for strategy. Derek's voice was sharp. Every minute we wait, more people suffer. More employees get trapped in toxic environments. We end this now. Michael sighed. All right. Give me a few minutes. Derek ended the call and ran a hand through his hair. Then he turned back to the employees. Jasmine, Miles, Kenny. They were still seated at the breakroom table, their eyes filled with cautious hope. We found out why your complaints were ignored, Derek said. And it wasn't just Halverson. Jasmine frowned. What do you mean? Derek exhaled. The executive overseeing this region, David Spencer, was filtering complaints before they even reached corporate HR. That's why nothing changed. Kenny's jaw dropped. Wait, so you mean someone higher up was covering for guys like Halverson? Derek nodded. Miles swore under his breath. Unbelievable. Jasmine shook her head, a bitter smile forming. Actually, it makes perfect sense. Of course, he had backup. Derek took a deep breath. I want you to know, this ends tonight. Spencer's going to answer for this. And if anyone else was involved, they'll answer too. Jasmine studied him carefully. Then, for the first time, she asked, Why are you doing this? Derek blinked. What do you mean? She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. You're the CEO of a bank, Derek. Most executives would have just fired Halverson and called it a day. But you're here. You're digging deeper. You're actually listening. Why? Derek considered his words carefully. Then, finally, he spoke. Because I've been where you are. Silence. Kenny frowned. Wait. What? Derek gave a small smile, but there was no humor in it. I started my career as a teller. I know what it's like to have a manager who treats you like you're disposable. I know what it's like to feel powerless. Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. Derek continued. But I was lucky. I had people who saw potential in me. People who gave me a chance to move up. If I hadn't, maybe I'd still be behind that counter, dealing with guys like Halverson every day. He exhaled. So yeah, I'm the CEO now, but that doesn't mean I forgot what it's like to be at the bottom. The room was quiet. Then, slowly, Jasmine smiled. Well, she said, it's about damn time we had someone up top who actually remembers what it's like down here. Derek chuckled. You have no idea how much I agree with that. The fall of David Spencer. 30 minutes later, Derek sat alone in his car, staring at his phone screen. Michael had done his job. David Spencer was on the line. Derek took a deep breath and answered. David. The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled. Derek, what's this about? Michael said it was urgent. Derek didn't waste time. I know about the complaints you buried. Silence. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Derek's grip on the wheel tightened. Yes, you do. I have the records. I have the employee turnover reports, and I have a branch full of people who can confirm that their complaints never went anywhere. David exhaled sharply. Derek, you're making a mistake. I was trying to protect the company. Derek's voice turned ice cold. By protecting predators like Halverson. Another pause. Then, this isn't how things work, Derek. You're new to the CEO position. You don't understand the politics of. Save it, Derek interrupted. You're done. David scoffed. You can't fire me over a phone call. Derek smirked. You're right. I already sent the termination paperwork to HR before I called you. Silence. Then, for the first time, David's voice wavered. You'll regret this. Derek's voice was like steel. No, you will. He ended the call. And just like that, another corrupt executive fell. A new future. Derek looked up at the stars through his windshield, exhaling. Tonight had been a battle. But the war was far from over. Because there were still more branches, more Halversons, more Spencers, and Derek Lawson. He was going to find every single one of them and burn their empire to the ground. The revolution begins. David Spencer was gone. Ron Halverson was gone. Two men who had abused their power, manipulated employees, and buried complaints to protect their own interests had been removed from Ashford National Bank in less than 24 hours. But Derek Lawson knew the real fight was just beginning. The system that allowed these men to thrive was still standing. And Derek was about to burn it to the ground. The morning after, Derek barely slept. By the time the sun began to rise, he was already reviewing emails, fielding calls, and preparing for the next step. He had sent an urgent memo to the entire executive team overnight. Emergency meeting. 9:00 a.m. Attendance required. No explanation. No agenda. Just a time. By 8:30 a.m., Derek was already at the Ashford National Bank headquarters, seated at the head of the long glass conference table. One by one, the executives filed in. Some looked nervous. Some looked curious. Some, like Michael Grant, already knew what was coming. David Spencer's empty chair at the table spoke volumes. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Derek stood. "We have a problem," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And we're about to fix it." The room fell silent. Derek placed his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. For years, Ashford National Bank has been operating under the illusion that our system works, that our employees are happy, that our leadership is competent. He let that sink in before continuing. That illusion shattered last night. Some of the executives exchanged uneasy glances. Derek continued. I personally fired a branch manager for workplace abuse. Then, I fired one of our senior executives for burying complaints and protecting bad managers. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Some already knew, but some didn't. Derek could see it in their faces, the realization that he wasn't bluffing. I didn't call this meeting for debate. I didn't call it to discuss next steps. I called it to tell you what's going to happen. He turned to Michael. Have the reports been compiled? Michael nodded and slid a folder across the table. Derek picked it up and held it up for everyone to see. This document contains every complaint filed against a manager in the last 5 years. Every branch where turnover spiked. Every regional supervisor who ignored red flags. And as of this morning, we are reviewing every single case. A murmur spread through the room. Derek wasn't just cleaning up one branch. He was investigating all of them. The new Ashford National Bank. Derek let them talk for a moment before he raised a hand. Silence fell again. From this moment forward, our company culture is changing. And if you can't keep up, then you don't belong here. He walked around the table, making eye contact with each executive. First, our complaint system is being rebuilt from the ground up. No more regional reviews. Every single employee concern, no matter how small, goes straight to corporate HR. He turned to Michael. And I want an independent audit of our HR department. We need to know who else was covering for people like Spencer. If they knew and did nothing, they're gone. Michael nodded, already in motion. Derek turned back to the table. Second, we are implementing mandatory leadership training for every manager at every branch. If they fail, they don't get to be managers. Period. One of the executives, Lisa Monroe, head of retail banking, cleared her throat. Derek, do you realize how many branches we have? This kind of initiative is going to be difficult. Derek finished for her. Yes. Expensive. Yes. Worth it? Absolutely. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. All right. I'll get my team on it. Derek continued. Third, every branch will have a direct line to my office. If an employee feels like they're being mistreated and their manager isn't listening, they can come straight to me. No gatekeepers. Some of the executives looked really uncomfortable now. Derek didn't care. And last, he said, anyone found abusing their power, anyone protecting toxic managers, anyone making employees feel unsafe, will be fired immediately. No second chances. Silence. Then, finally, someone spoke. This is a major shift, one executive said carefully. Are you sure we're ready for this? Derek exhaled sharply. We don't have a choice. We should have done this years ago. Nobody argued, because they all knew he was right. A CEO who stands with his employees. By the time the meeting ended, Derek knew he had shaken the company to its core. But that was the point. Change doesn't come quietly. It comes when someone stands up and says, enough. By noon, the company-wide announcement was sent out. By 2:00 p.m., Ashford National Bank's social media pages posted a formal statement about the investigation, making it clear that leadership was committed to rebuilding trust. By 4:00 p.m., emails from employees started pouring in, some thanking Derek, some cautiously optimistic, and some sharing their own horror stories from other branches. By 6:00 p.m., national news outlets were already reporting on it. By 9:00 p.m., other CEOs in the banking industry were watching him. But Derek didn't care about them. He cared about Jasmine, Miles, Kenny, and every other employee who had been ignored for years. The final visit. 2 days later, Derek returned to the Columbus branch. The atmosphere was different, lighter. Employees weren't looking over their shoulders anymore. The tension had lifted. Jasmine was at her station, helping a customer. When she saw Derek walk in, she smiled. Not a forced, polite smile. A real one. Derek walked up to her counter. "How's it going?" Jasmine grinned. "Well, I didn't cry in the break room today, so that's an improvement." Derek chuckled. "That's what I like to hear." Jasmine tilted her head. "So, does this mean you'll be doing more undercover visits?" Derek smirked. "Oh, absolutely." She laughed. "Good. Just give us a little warning next time." Derek grinned. "Where's the fun in that?" She shook her head, still smiling. "Well, in that case, I guess we'll always have to be on our best behavior." Derek's smile softened. "No, Jasmine. You just have to be treated right." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thanks, Derek, for everything." Derek gave her a small nod. "You deserve it." And for the first time, he knew this wasn't just about one branch. It was about building a company where every employee mattered. A company where no one was afraid to speak up. A company where no one was left behind. And Derek Lawson, he was just getting started.